encourage them. And so I just encourage you as a congregation to do that, and I really expect that to happen. I've been asked to preach this evening on the servant's call to lead. The servant's call to lead, and as Brother Todd has already talked about, the importance of leadership and the importance that is in the congregation and really any organization, really. But we're, of course, focusing here on the church tonight. But just the importance of leadership. Now, I think sometimes churches have tried to say, well, let's kind of let everybody be leaders. And I haven't seen real good results with that. I'm not saying that can't work, but I haven't seen real good results with that. It seems like usually either things fall apart or by default somebody becomes a leader if they don't have the title. And so according to scriptures, leadership is necessary for the church. And so some people might say, well, why is it such a big deal of choosing leaders and the way we do this? And the answer to that is, it is a big deal. It is. And that's why so much time and effort and so on goes into something like this. I think it gives new meaning. This pops into my mind. But there where it says, lay hands suddenly on no man. And I think that's wise counsel from the scriptures. Take our time and let the Lord lead in that. The other evening we read over in the book of Matthew chapter 20 where Jesus instructed his disciples. But tonight I'd like to turn just for a little bit, just to start out, and then I'm going to come back to 1 Samuel. But over in Luke 22, I think this is the same account that we read from over in Matthew 20, but it reads just a little bit differently, and it tells what was going on there with the disciples. But in Luke 22, verse 24, it says, and there was also a strife among them, among the disciples, which of them should be accounted the greatest. And he said unto them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors, but ye shall not be so. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that is chief as he that doth serve. And here again, as I said the other evening, it's just so opposite of what the way the world looks at leadership. I'd like to illustrate tonight this whole concept of the servant's call to lead and what Jesus taught there. I'd like to illustrate that from the life of David. And usually we think of David, he was the greatest, probably the greatest king that Israel had. Probably the best known king that Israel had. Solomon would have run a close second, of course. But David is known for being a king. I found it fascinating. Just a few weeks ago, my wife and I sat down and we watched, it was after it had happened, but we watched the ceremony of the dedication of the American embassy in Jerusalem. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but I found that to be fascinating. And one of the things I noticed was that David was mentioned different times. And they called it the city of David, and mentioned about David. He was the founder. I mean, he was the one that established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And it's just fascinating. They gave the period of 3,500 years ago. And it was fascinating to listen to them say some of the things that they did. Now, I'd like to deal with David's early life, not after he became king, but some of the events that led up to that. Because while we think of David as a great leader and king, God took many years and took him through a lot of different things to prepare him for that time. And I've listed 5 different tests that God took him through in order to prepare him. And some of these tests, I think, can continue on in a person's life, but I think it's some of the tests that we face in life. And we need to recognize that God uses these things in order to help us to grow and to change. The first test, and we're going to start out here. You can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16. And the first test that I have is that the test of being the youngest. This is the test of being the youngest. Now, I don't know of any of you here that would be the youngest brother of 8 boys. You ever stop and think about that? Of what that would be like? The youngest of 8 boys. Talk about being on the bottom of the totem pole. I remember 3 brothers talking one time and said, as they were reminiscing on their childhood, they said the oldest thought of it, the middle one did it, and the youngest one got blamed. And so David was way down at the end. And it comes to this day, this feast day, when Samuel, the leader of Israel, is coming to town, and they specifically have been invited to the feast. Jesse and his sons. But somebody needed to stay home. And that somebody ended up being David. And he was taking care of the sheep. And I could just hear the boys saying, it doesn't matter if David goes. He's just young. And he's unimportant. But we make sure we're there. And so we see that. We do not catch any indication that he resented it. I sense that he was willing to do that. And I sense that because of things that happened later. But I think he did. I think he was willing to do that. You know, David's first leadership class was out there taking care of sheep. And I think that was probably a pretty good place to start. I always have this memory. I was pretty young, and it always stuck with me, but a discouraged owner of sheep said, I heard him say, there's only one thing dumber than a sheep, and that's the guy that owns them. But they can be difficult. And so I didn't mean to offend any sheep owners here, but he learned from that. And but let's go now to 1 Samuel 16, starting at verse 11. And we know what happened before that. And it says, and Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down until he come hither. And he sent and brought him in, and now he was ruddy, and with all of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. And so we have there the account where David was called from the sheep. Just a couple of lessons there I think we can learn. You know, I don't think we're really ready to lead until we know how to follow. I'll say that again. I don't think we're ready to lead until we know how to follow. Now, we have a lot of classes on leadership, and it's good. I think that's wonderful. We need to do that. But I don't see many classes on being good followers. And but I think that it's very important. And really, you know, before we get into those leadership classes and so on, I think that's one of the things that a church needs to look at when they are calling people to leadership. And that is, are they a good follower? Do they know how to submit to authority? Do they know how to respect authority? And so on. And so I think David learned that. And I think he accepted that as a young person. The second test that I see with David, and that is the test of waiting on God's timing. It was quite a few years. It was quite a few years before he became king, after he was anointed. But I think it was maybe even a number of years that, and again, as I read this, some of this is a little vague, and we don't know exactly some of the ages here, how many years took place. But we see here in verse 13 then, it says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. That stood out to me. In the midst of his brethren. This is this little boy that didn't amount to much. And all of a sudden, in the midst of his brethren, he's anointed king, a future king. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And so Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. And so we had that anointing happening. Something took place there, right with the other boys. And then we have, it goes on, and it seems like I get the feeling then that things just pretty much continued in the Jesse household like it has before. Verse 14, But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servant said unto him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. And Saul said unto his servants, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. And then answered one of the servants and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. And wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, Send me David thy son. And notice that next phrase, which is with the sheep. Now, one thing that gives me an indication that there could have been a number of years between his anointing and going to play the harp for Saul was what it says there in verse 18. This man said, I've seen this man. He's a valiant man, a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person. Now, a few of those descriptions would have been back there in number 12, where he was brought in. And there were some descriptions of him there, but there's a lot more. It just seems like here you see an older David. You see more things about him. And you see more of a grown-up David than you did back there. Now, this is, of course, speculation on my part, but it just seems like there could have been several years in between there. And again, he's keeping the sheep. He's still low man on the totem pole. You know, I got a feeling keeping the sheep wasn't the highest honor at home. And so there he was, still keeping the sheep. Now, David could have had the attitude. Now listen, brothers. You know, you remember what Samuel did to me? And he could have used that to try to elevate himself among them and try to use that on them. But it seemed like David here, remember it says, God's Spirit came upon him. And you know, I believe one of the marks of God's Spirit is that it's a mark of humility. It's a mark, when God's Spirit is on us, it's not like we are trying to push ourselves forward and to go ahead in our own strength. But I think David had that sense. Someday, that's what Samuel said, someday, but I'm going to let God choose that day. And I think that's so important for us to learn in the church. Wait on the Lord's timing, but use that time to learn. You may sense that call of God on your life. And I see David developing those added descriptions in his life. And I see that developing there. And so use that time of waiting. Instead of trying to force your way or push your way and that type of thing, say, God, just work in me. Help me develop and learn what you want me to do. The third thing I see is the test of fame. The test of fame. And here again, we don't know how long it was between the time of going to play the harp for Saul and the time of slaying Goliath. We don't have a firm feel of those years. We do know that it seemed like when they went out to battle, and some of David's brothers went with the army, that David went home, and what was he doing? Again, he was keeping the sheep. And I had to think, he could have resented that. I think you find that over in 17, verse 15. It says that David was the youngest, and the three eldest followed Saul into the battle. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep in Bethlehem. Somebody needed to take care of things at home. And David left the palace and went back home and again took care of the sheep. Well, we all know the story. I'm not going to go into that story of Goliath and so on. We all know that story well. But after, and let's go over to chapter 18, after that took place, after the slaying of Goliath, David became in Israel an instant rock star. Now that may be a little play on words, but he was well known, and everybody praised him. And let's just look at some of the things that David had going for him. He comes to great fame. Chapter 18, verse 1, and it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. And then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. I mean, just look at all he had going for him. The king's son became his closest friend. The women, and we see that in the next verses there, began to sing his praises. He was set over the men of war. He became a leader over these men of war. He was popular with all the people, and it says that Saul's servants, they all liked David. He was very popular. But verse 5 shows us how he reacted. And it says, he went out wherever Saul sent him. It didn't lift him up. He didn't say, you know, I can pretty well do what I want now, and I can get by with it. But he subjected himself to Saul. He did as he was told, and it says he behaved himself wisely. Sometimes people think that in order to be in real leadership, they have to have the number one position. And that's not the case. You think of Joseph. Joseph was never the number one leader in Egypt. You take Daniel. He was never the number one leader in Babylon. And yet they had a tremendous influence in both of those places. And I think we do not learn to become real leaders, and we're not ready for the, you might say, the number one position. I kind of hate to use that, but we all understand what we mean, because there always has to be a number one leader. There has to be. But we're not ready for that until we've learned to lead with others. You see, there was other people that David had to work with. He had to be subject to Saul. He had to work with the other men of war. And that is so important. And I think that there's a lesson there, I believe, that we can learn. You know, I've come to really appreciate what is often referred to as a plural ministry in the church. I have just really appreciated that over the years. And sometimes we use different names for that. We call ours our leadership team and a ministry team, or whatever the name we give to it. But it is so important. It is so important. And Trevor, I just really challenge you with this, that as you work with your fellow ministers, just to really work together. You know, your team, the team that Brother Todd leads, is not a team made up of 5 different ministries. It's one ministry made up of 5 different ministers. And it needs to be that way. It needs to be where there is a common goal. And while you've been given responsibilities of leadership, at the same time, there's still responsibilities of being under authority. Now, lest you think that Todd doesn't have to be under anybody's authority, no, that's not the case. I've always said, you know, we don't just have one person we're under, sometimes we have 200. And you know, but it's so important to work together and to care for each other and to listen to each other. And you know, we give and we take and so on. But it needs to be a cooperative effort. And I just really challenge you in that. I'm sure you'll do that, but I think it's something we need to be aware of. Now, I'd like to go to test number 4, and that's the test of disappointment. That's the test of disappointment. You know, we're all going to face that. And David did too. Look what happened to David. It was no fault of his own. David, sometimes our disappointments come because it's our own fault. But here with David, it was not his fault. There in chapter 18, verse 8 and 9, it says that this was after the women started singing their song. You know, David has slain his 10,000s and Saul his thousands, and how they had that all played out. In verse 8, Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. What can he have more than the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with, I never noticed that before. I shouldn't stop and say that. Saul even prophesied there. But he prophesied in the midst of the house, and David played with his hand, and as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Now talk about disappointment. Talk about 1 minute being on top of the world and everybody loving you, and the next minute escaping the king's javelin. It wasn't his fault. But all of a sudden, Saul turned against him out of jealousy and fear. And not only that, it says it happened twice. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. And see what else Saul did. And Saul removed him from him. In other words, don't be close to me. And made him his captain over 1,000. Remember, he had been over all the men of war. He made him a captain. He demoted him. He made him a captain over 1,000. And it says, and he went out and came in before the people, and David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Now, can you imagine? That kind of a demotion, going from having all of that popularity and everything, and all of a sudden the king turning on you, trying to kill you, putting him down lower in his office and so on. And he just went down a long ways. But how did he react? It says that he behaved himself wisely. He behaved himself. I always like that expression there. He behaved himself wisely. I think he continued doing what he had done. He continued just simply going on and serving the way that he was supposed to. There again, there's some lessons. I think lessons for us in the ministry, and that is there is going to be disappointment in the ministry. Sometimes it can be our fault, and sometimes it's not. And we can be tempted. We can be tempted to lash out in anger. We can be tempted to blame. We can be tempted to give up. But instead, I believe that the Spirit of God is upon us. We can behave ourselves wisely. And say, Lord, you're in control of this. You are in control of this. You take care of this situation. And then the last one is the test of fear and revenge. The test of fear and revenge. David had to flee. We know that story well. Saul continued to try to kill him. And I don't know how many years it was. But I think David had a lot of fear of Saul. Matter of fact, I'm not so sure that David didn't make a few mistakes. Remember the couple times he went down to the Philistines and was going to live with them and so on? Out of fear, I think he made some mistakes there. And we may make some mistakes. But one thing David refused to do was to seek revenge on Saul. That just always amazes me when you see how he treated Saul. He had a couple of opportunities to kill him. Because he's right there. He could have easily done it. And but he refused to do it. He refused to let anyone else do it. Matter of fact, when that man came, when Saul died, and that man came and said, "I'm the one that killed him," David had him killed. And go to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 1. This is just always amazing to me. Of a man that tried to hunt down David. And go to verse 17. And this was right after he found out that Saul and Jonathan had been killed. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Verse 19. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty